Hey guys, so I almost didn't want to make this video because there's just so many videos about the EOS R on YouTube already, but I wanted to share my experience, especially with a lot of newer cameras coming out right now. And I've had this camera for over 6 months now, and what I do is I shoot photo and video, mostly for social media and YouTube for myself, but also for other companies and brands that are using this stuff for their social media marketing. And especially with now the 1DX3 being out, the Canon R5 coming out, Sony, Nikon, and Panasonic's cameras, I wanted to talk about, is this camera still even relevant? And if so, for whom? If you're looking at buying a camera, should you hold off and wait for one of those newer cameras, or would this even be a good option for you? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the specs. This camera's been out for a while. There's tons of videos on YouTube talking about the specs. So just really quickly, it's a 30.3 megapixel sensor, full frame sensor. It can do technically up to 8 frames in continuous shooting mode and stills, but really, if you want to use autofocus, it limits it to 5 frames per second. It has like 5,812 autofocus points, not really, but it's over 5,000. Basically, 90% or something of the sensor is covered in autofocus points. And it uses Canon's dual pixel autofocus, not only on the back of the screen like you would have in live view with a DSLR, but because it's a mirrorless, also in the electronic viewfinder. It has a maximum shutter speed of 1/8000th of a second. It has built-in Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. For video, it can do 4K up to 30 frames per second, but of course with the 1.74 times crop that you have in 4K. In 1080 full frame, you can do up to 60 frames per second, and there is 720 up to 120 frames per second, but in that mode, you are losing all autofocus. And then of course, there's the fact that this camera only has one SD card slot. It is a UHS 2 SD card slot, so it is a faster SD card slot, but you can't shoot redundantly. For me, that's not an issue. Even when I've used cameras that do have multiple memory card slots, I never shoot redundant. If you do have to shoot redundant, then obviously this isn't for you. I would also say that if you shoot video, even most cameras that do have dual card slots don't allow you to shoot video redundantly, so that's something to keep in mind as well. I don't need it, so it's not a big deal for me, but if it is a big deal for you, then you might as well stop watching here. Alright, so for this part, I actually switched cameras so that I can have the EOS R as a reference and talk about it. And so I'm using a different camera. It's going to look slightly different for this next part. But ergonomically, this is one of my favorite camera bodies. It's compact for a full frame camera, but also like substantial at the same time. As far as what you have on the body, the normal shutter dial, the aperture dial is up here, which is a little weird, but doesn't bother me at all. Then you have this touch bar, which a lot of people have been really upset about. I don't hate it. I understand that it's definitely not the best working system, but I always set it with this lock button, and once you lock it, you don't accidentally hit it. It knows that it's locked. And I think people were upset that it was as sensitive as it is. If you don't lock it, yeah, you're going to hit it without knowing it, and there's no real feedback other than that it shows up on the screen that the settings are changing. But as long as you are being careful to lock it, I actually think that it comes in handy. Another thing people have complained about is the weird placement of the record button. You have to move your finger back a little bit. I don't think it's that weird of a motion. I don't think it's a motion that people have talked about having to crank their finger. I think that's a little dramatic. I do think if you had like joint issues or something, then that could potentially be a reason why you might not like it. It might not work so well for you. One cool thing about it though is that if you're in stills mode shooting photos and you hit this record button, it will automatically start recording video in whatever you save as your custom settings for the custom 3 slot. One thing I really like about this camera is that all of the buttons, dials, everything on it are really customizable. So if you pick up one person's EOS R, it's probably going to feel and work a lot differently than somebody else's. The EOS R is capable of USB-C charging with the LPE6N batteries, not the older ones, but the updated versions. And To do this, you have to have a USB-C charging cable, obviously, but that's not included with the camera. But if you have like a MacBook Pro or something that comes with a USB-C charging cable, you can use that, and that's what I do. So now we've talked about the ergonomics and build of the camera body. I'm gonna switch back to this camera and we'll keep going. So let's talk about photography with this camera, and basically Canon 5D Mark IV in a mirrorless body, which is amazing. And it actually has an updated processor, so low light on this camera is actually even probably just a little bit better than on the 5D Mark IV. And the 5D Mark IV is something that's been kind of the standard for professional photographers outside of sports photography. Obviously, we're gonna use something like the 1DX Mark III, but other than that, since the 5D Mark IV came out, it's kind of been the standard for a lot of photographers. So the image quality that you're getting out of this is awesome. Everybody talks about Canon colors, and it's for a reason. The colors coming straight out of this camera are awesome. I've actually started, especially for my personal stuff, shooting RAW plus JPEG, because a lot of the times I'm happy enough with the JPEGs that are coming straight out of this camera that I don't even really need to go back and edit them. So I can, get family photos and stuff like that and send them to people. So the updated eye tracking and autofocus performance in this camera in general is really nice. If you're shooting anything with people in it, portraits, events, something like that, where you want to be focused on somebody's eye, this camera makes life really, really easy and really, really nice. It takes a lot of the struggle out of trying to get a really nice image. You can focus on just your composition and your settings, your lighting, that kind of thing, and not have to think about, is the eye going to be perfectly in focus every time? Now, one thing plenty of people have pointed out is that it is missing any kind of joystick on the back to select your autofocus point more quickly. You are able to use the touchscreen on the back to select your focus point even when you're using the EVF. And for most instances that works fine. It is a little bit slower, but the good thing is with eye tracking autofocus, you're not going to have to be selecting your autofocus point very much when you're shooting people. And outside of that, your subjects are typically not going to be moving very quickly, so you don't have to grab focus on them super, super quickly. The tracking can take care of the things that you do need to follow that are moving quickly. So in most cases, for most people, it's probably not an issue, but I think most people would have preferred to have the joystick there. So because of that missing a joystick, continuous shooting isn't very fast, 5 frames per second tops if you're using autofocus. This is not really an action shooting camera, so sports and wildlife, this probably isn't for you. Also, because it's missing the second card slot, it's probably not for most wedding photographers, but if those things aren't a deal breaker for you, this camera delivers really great image quality and performance, and I have been only happy with the results I've gotten out of it. So now we come to the video features for this camera, and here it's very much a mixed bag. I mean, again, we have amazing image quality and colors in this camera, and you have things like 8-bit 420 C-Log internally and 10-bit 422 C-Log externally, which is really great. But then at the same time, if you want to film in 4K, you have that 1.74 times crop. So you're not filming full frame 4K on this camera, you're filming more like an APS-C and a little bit smaller even than APS-C 4K. Of course, one of the things that can come in handy because of the 4K crop is that you can use both EF and EFS lenses with the R if you're using the Canon adapter. And that's one thing that I haven't actually mentioned yet, is that this camera has the RF mount, which is Canon's new full frame mirrorless mount. And they have some amazing lenses for that mount, but I haven't personally gotten any. They're also pretty pricey. I do plan to get some hopefully in the near future, but at this point I'm just adapting EF lenses to the camera. And that is something that is really nice to be able to do, that you can bring your old DSLR lenses that you might have, or even still buy new and used DSLR lenses to use on this camera and not have to worry about functionality issues. So if you do want to shoot in full frame on this camera, you do have to shoot 1080 full HD, and I'm not going to defend that because it would be really nice to shoot full frame in 4K on this camera, but that's not an option. I will say, however, that first of all, the 1080 in this camera is really, really nice. It shoots 1080 at 180 megabits per second, and just to kind of put that into perspective for you, if you're not sure what that means, For instance, with like the Sony a7 III, the 4K is topped at 100 megabits per second. So you still have a lot of data and information, even if it's not quite as much resolution as you would have when shooting in 4K. Another thing to take into account if you're doing stuff like me where you're shooting for YouTube and social media is the amount of compression that those platforms put on video. And really, you're kind of wasting your own time and space and money on memory cards and that kind of thing, and being a lot harder on your computer and editing systems if you're shooting in 4K, because you don't really need to. Those platforms aren't really giving you the full benefit of 4K. And for all of those platforms, almost everybody is consuming them on their phones. And even if their phones can display 4K, I don't think at this point there's a big enough difference in what you see in a 1080 resolution on your phone versus 4K resolution on your phone on a social media platform to really make it necessary to put the extra time and money and effort into producing 4K content for those platforms. YouTube does allow you to upload in 4K, but it's 4K with a lot of compression on it, just like the 1080 upload has a lot of compression in it. So if you have a camera that does really well in 1080, what I do is film everything in 1080, export in 4K and upload it in 4K, and then your footage doesn't get quite as crushed by the YouTube compression. Of course, there's no in-body image stabilization with this camera. It does have a digital image stabilization, which works pretty well, not the enhanced, but just the normal version of the image stabilization. Certainly for YouTube videos and stuff, I have no problem putting that on if I'm hand holding the camera or something. I haven't quite gotten to the point where I trust it to put it on for doing client work, but I might experiment with that in the future and see how it does, because the results I've seen from it are pretty good actually. This camera also isn't the best option for someone who needs a lot of super slow motion. The only 120 frames per second option that we have is in 720. Now the 720 does look good for what it is, but what it is 720. It's going to be plenty of resolution for something to use on like social media, but when you do film in 720 at 120 frames per second, you lose autofocus and you lose sound. Now, there is 60 frames at 1080, and that's what I use for most things, and it works really well in a lot of cases. It gives it a different feel than 120 frames per second, but you can't use it for action slow motion. I will say though that for me, 120 frames per second, when it's not action, tends to be too slow. But that's just a personal preference and something that you'll have to get used to either way. Then of course we have the fabled flip out screen, which for anyone that's filming theirself, I think is an absolute necessity, but it's also really nice for when you're filming low angles or high angles, or when you're on a gimbal or something to monitor your footage. I think it makes life so much easier. One more thing I want to point out about the lack of full frame 4K. There aren't really any cameras, without getting into a much higher price point, that can film slow motion of any kind full frame in 4K. And if you need slow motion, then you have to film at least 1080. And then you're giving your client videos that aren't in 4K completely anyway. So then I kind of have the question is, do you really need 4K when you're filming these videos? And you know, that's a personal question. For me, I think if you're delivering 4K videos to your clients, you need to make sure that you're charging for 4K. I've never had a client that has even ever asked me about resolution. And if a client does come and say that they absolutely need 4K and have a legitimate reason for needing 4K, I'll be happy to film in 4K with them. But there's going to be extra costs because of the extra costs of memory, of time, and of what it takes for my system to edit that file. But again, in the end, most clients want a great image and they're not worried about the specs that it takes to get there. Another really awesome point about this camera is that it can do 4K 10-bit 422 externally in C-Log, and that really brings you close to getting cinema quality footage on the same level as almost like a C200. Now, I'm not saying it is on the same level, but for the price point and the price difference between this camera and the C200, you're getting really competitive quality for like a third of the price. So I love this camera. It's perfect for my needs, which again are content creation, social media work for myself and for clients, and then portrait work every now and then. I think this camera performs way above its spec list, and I think the fact that so many people, and especially people on YouTube and this platform, have adopted the camera kind of speak to that. Now, is it relevant with all the other cameras that are coming out right now? So right now, this camera is selling for $17.99 US. And for that price point and what you're getting out of this, I think this camera is an amazing value. Not to mention, when the R5 does come out, it's fairly likely that, maybe not immediately, but pretty soon thereafter, the price on this camera will more than likely start to drop, and then it'll be an even better value for the money. Obviously, this camera is not going to be able to compete with what the R5 can do. Probably won't be able to compete with what the R6 can do, but it's also going to be in a very different price range from those cameras. So while this camera doesn't film RAW, it doesn't film in 8K, you really have to ask yourself, do you actually need that? So I think this camera is definitely not irrelevant for specific needs in a specific budget. So who do I think this camera is for? Again, I will say I think this is the perfect content creator camera. It doesn't have the best 4K specs, but for content creation, you really don't need 4K. 4K is going to be wasted on compression in social media platforms. There's also a camera that can be very compact. It has the flip screen, and most importantly, great image quality. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you're interested in this camera or any of the gear that I've talked about in this video, I'm gonna leave affiliate links in the description down below. If you use those links without any extra cost to you, you can support this channel so that I can continue to make videos for you guys. If you like this one, give it a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments, what camera are you using? Are you using the EOS R? Have you looked into it? Have you had a chance to use it? Do you think it is relevant or irrelevant right now? And if you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button. See you guys.